Hey everybody, this video is called Suppliers and Laborers, and today we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2nd Chronicles, looking at the 2nd chapter. We're going to be looking at the suppliers and workers for the temple. So 2nd Chronicles chapter 2 verse 1, it starts out, "Then Solomon determined to build a temple for the name of the Lord and a royal house for himself." So today's chapter reports on how Solomon selected men to gather building materials for this glorious temple. And this is in addition to the massive supplies that were given by David that was stockpiled back in 1 Chronicles 22. And last week we looked at 1 Chronicles 29. And this chapter is parallel to 1 Kings chapter 5. And Solomon didn't only build a great temple, but he built a spectacular place for himself, as we saw back in 1 Kings chapter 7. And before you go prosperity gospel crazy with Solomon, know that it was very common in the ancient world for kings to build themselves a new house when they took reign, and they would have a magnificent type house. But verse 2, it says, "Solomon selected 70,000 men to bear burdens, 80,000 to quarry stone in the mountains, and 3,600 to oversee them." So these numbers here in verse 2 are repeated later on in verses 17 and 18. In 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 16, it tells us that there were 3,300 overseers compared to the 3,600 in verse 18. And if, however, the additional supervisors are added, as 2 Chronicles 8:10 shows 250, but it shows 550 in 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 23, then both the 1 Kings and 2 Kings agree that the total amount of men worked was 3,850. And David had done similarly at an earlier date back in 1 Chronicles 22 verse 2. In verse 3 through 10 here it says, "Then Solomon sent Hiram, king of Tyre, saying, As you have dealt with David my father and sent him cedars to build himself a house to dwell in, so deal with me. Behold, I am building a temple for the name of the Lord my God, to dedicate it to him, to burn before him sweet incense, for the continual showbread, for the burnt offerings morning and evening, on the Sabbaths, on the new moons, and on the set feast of the Lord our God. This is an ordinance forever to Israel. And the temple which I built will be great, for our God is greater than all gods. But who is able to build him a temple, since heaven and the heavens of heavens cannot contain him? Who am I then, that I should build him a temple, except to burn sacrifice before him? Therefore send me at once a man skillful in work, to work in gold and silver and bronze and iron and purple and crimson and blue, who has skill to engrave the skillful men who are with me in Judah and Jerusalem, whom David my father provided. Also send me cedar and cypress and algum logs from Lebanon, for I know that your servants have skill to cut timber in Lebanon, and indeed my servants will be your servants to prepare timber for me in abundance. For the temple which I am about to build shall be great and wonderful. And indeed I will give to your servants the woodsmen who cut timber, 20,000 cores of ground wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil." So the differences between here and 1 Kings 5 can be accounted for in much as the same way of the Gospels, by combining the narratives of 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 3 through 6 and here to complete the entire correspondence. And Solomon, he recognized that his temple was incapable of containing the omniscient creator. And nevertheless, the splendor of the temple must reflect the greatness of God. And Solomon recognized that he was unworthy of God's blessing as his father was before him. And the Israelites, they were familiar with agriculture, but they were not metal working. And so the Israelites, they needed experts for that. And the algum was a coniferous tree to Lebanon, and some identify it as sandalwood, which was a smooth, expensive redwood that would be polished to a high gloss. And the listing of goods in verse 10 is more complete than what we saw back in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. And so Lebanon, they traded with Israel regularly for food. And a bath here measured approximately 6 gallons. So that would make about 20,000 to 120,000 gallons. 20,000 baths to 120,000 gallons. And the 20 cores of pressed oil in 1 Kings 5:11 is most likely not a scribal error, but rather a finer grade of oil. And the payment here to the workers isn't the same annual payment to Hiram. In verse 11 through 16 it says, Then Hiram, king of Tyre, answered in writing, which he sent to Solomon, Because the Lord loves his people, he has made you king over them. Hiram also said, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who made heaven and earth, for he has given King David a wise son, endowed with prudence and understanding, who will build a temple for the Lord and a royal house for himself. And now I have sent a skillful man endowed with understanding, Hiram, my master craftsman, the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre, skilled to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, stone and wood, purple and blue, fine linen, and crimson, to make any engraving and to accomplish any plan which may be given to him with your skillful men and with the skillful men of my lord David your father. Now therefore the wheat, the barley, the oil, and the wine, which my lord has spoken of, let him send it to his servants, and he will cut wood from Lebanon as much as you need. We will bring it to you by the rafts by sea to Joppa, and you will carry it to Jerusalem. So, as you probably noticed already, I've been quoting a lot that this passage is very similar to what we're given back in 1 Kings chapter 5. So what I recommend is that you go watch that video for 1 Kings chapter 5 that was done back in January, and I can send it to you, or you can read the chapter while you're watching this video. But Hiram's words are intended as no more than diplomatic courtesy. So the chronicler quotes them in verse 11 to show the establishment of the Davidic line is an act of divine love toward Israel. And the common identification of the true God when pagans spoke of or were told of him as the God who made heaven and earth, also seen later in 2 Chronicles 36 verse 23, Ezra 1:2, Ezra 5 verse 11 and 12, Ezra 6 verse 10, Ezra chapter 7 verse 12, Ezra chapter 7 verse 21, Ezra chapter 7 verse 23, and Jeremiah chapter 10 verse 11 through 12. And in our wrap up here, we're going to look at some examples given in the New Testament as well. But verse 13 and 14 in 1 Kings 7:14, it states that his mother was of the tribe of Naphtali, not Dan as reported here. And this can be resolved if she was of Naphtali by birth, but living in the territory of Dan, or if his parents were originally from the two tribes, then he could legitimately claim either. And he was parallel to Bezalel, who constructed the tabernacle. In Joppa, we hear the place of Joppa in the Bible many times. You know, it was a major coastal plain, or port, of Israel. And you probably think of Joppa more when you look at Jonah, which we'll be looking in Jonah chapter 1 verse 3, would sail from there. And so verse 17 to 18 to wrap up the chapter, it says, Then Solomon numbered all the aliens who were in the land of Israel after the census in which David his father had numbered them, and there were found to be 153,600. And he made 70,000 of them bearers of burdens, 8,000 stone cutters in the mountain, and 3,600 overseers to make the people work. So in verse 17, 18, it tells us specifically where the 70,000 men labor force were described here, and in verse 2 came from. But to wrap up today's chapter, we see that the chronicler is giving us in today's chapter an overview of the work of the building of the temple with Solomon's determination. And we see the magnitude of this work. And we see that Solomon described the work to Hiram and request to him. And we saw Hiram's response to Solomon, and we see a very common identification that is given throughout the Old Testament and part of the New of the true God here, even across the Old New Testament as God. It describes God as who made the heaven and earth. And I want to go over to Acts chapter 4, verse 24. Acts 4:24 says, So when they heard that, they raised their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, you are God who made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. Verse 25, Who by the mouth of your servant David said, Why did the nations rage and the people plot vain things? The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. So we see in Peter's and John's arrests where the common identification of God who made heaven and earth is used. And I want to look at Colossians 1:16 and verse 17. And it says here, For by him all things were created, that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. So the Apostle Paul used the identification of God when he was speaking on Christ to those at the church of Colossae. And check out also Acts chapter 14, verse 15, and Acts 17, verse 24 through 26 for yourself to see further examples of the God who made the heavens and the earth. And the chronicler spoke of Joppa, which we even see in the New Testament impact. And I want to look at Acts chapter 10, verse 5. Acts 10:5 says, Now send men to Joppa and send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. So Peter was at Joppa to receive God's call in a vision. In the chronicler, he ends with the laborers who build the temple. And that's going to wrap up today's chapter. We'll see you next tomorrow. No Topical Saturday again this week. We'll have one next week. But we'll see you next as we'll be looking at the building of the temple in chapter 3 tomorrow. So have a great weekend up ahead. God bless, and I hope that you watch tomorrow's video.